The Solomon Sea lay deceptively calm under the morning sky. But on the bridge of the destroyer Shiryuki, Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura felt a prickle of dread. His 8 battle-hardened destroyers, veterans of Iron Bottom Sound's brutal night brawls, cut through the water, escorting 8 transports crammed with 900 Imperial Japanese troops, men desperately needed in Leh. Kimura's radar screens, primitive by Allied standards, remained stubbornly blank, offering no hint of the storm gathering on the horizon. His naval training, his years of experience, had prepared him for torpedoes, for surface gun duels, even for high-altitude bombers. But what was coming was something entirely new, something beyond the scope of Japanese doctrine, a terror for which they had no defense. Miles away, unseen and undetected, American B-25 Mitchel bombers were thundering across the waves at mast-top height. These were not the lumbering, distant bomb droppers the Japanese expected. These were flying battleships, transformed by a radical ingenuity into strafer gunships, bristling with more forward-firing machine guns than a squadron of fighters. Each B-25 was a concentrated spearhead of destruction, poised to unleash a wall of lead and fire. In a mere 15 minutes, these altered aircraft would shatter every assumption the Imperial Navy held about air attacks, demonstrating a cataclysmic shift in naval warfare. The convoy, having departed Rabaul on February 28, was a lifeline, carrying the 51st Infantry Division under Lieutenant General Nakano Hidemitsu. These troops, if they reached Leh, could tip the balance in New Guinea. Kimura understood the immense stakes and the calculated risk. War games at Rabaul had predicted 40 to 50% losses, but Imperial General Headquarters had grimly deemed those losses acceptable if even half the convoy got through. The alternative was a slow, agonizing defeat on the New Guinea coast. But what Kimura, scanning the horizon from the Shiryuki's bridge, couldn't possibly fathom was the genesis of the monstrous force about to descend upon him. The convoy had departed Rebel on February 28, 1943, with Kimura flying his admiral's flag from Shiryuki, leading destroyer Shikanami, Uranami, Tokatises, Ukayas, Azio, Arashio, and Asagumo, everyone. A Guadalcanal veteran that had survived the savage night battles of Iron Bottom, Sound escorting 8 transports, carrying the 51st Infantry Division under Lieutenant General Nakano Hidemitsu, troops that could tip the balance in New Guinea if they reached LA. And Kimura knew the risks, had studied the war games at Rabaul that predicted 40 to 50% losses from Allied air attack. But Imperial General Headquarters had deemed those losses acceptable if half the convoy got through, because the alternative was watching the Allies systematically destroy Japanese positions along the New Guinea coast without reinforcement. What Admiral Kimura couldn't know from his position on Shiryuki's bridge that morning, was that 500 meters south at Port Moresby, General George Kenny of the 5th Air Force had spent the last 3 months transforming his B-25 Mitchel bombers with a former Navy Chief Petty Officer named Paul Irvin Gunn, known to everyone as Papy, who had taken standard medium bombers and turned them into flying battleships, installing 4 forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns in the nose where the bombardier position used to be, adding 4 more in blister packages on the fuselage sides below the cockpit, creating a concentrated wall of firepower that could clear a destroyer's deck in seconds, while perfecting a technique called skip bombing, where the aircraft would come in at mast height 200 feet or less and bounce their bombs across the water like stones into the sides of ships. The modifications had begun after Kenny arrived in Australia in summer 1942 and discovered his bomber force was achieving a pathetic 3% accuracy rate against Japanese shipping. Watching helplessly as convoy after convoy delivered troops and supplies to sustain Japanese operations until Papy Gunn, a 52-year-old former enlisted naval aviator who'd been flying in the Philippines when war broke out, convinced him that the problem wasn't the bombing, but the approach that trying to hit moving ships from 0 feet was futile, that they needed to get down on the deck and deliver their ordnance at point-blank range. which meant suppressing the anti-aircraft fire that would tear apart any bomber making a low-level run, which meant guns. Lots of guns. Guns. More guns than any bomber had ever carried before. Gun had started with the A-20 Havocs of the 3rd Attack Group, installing 450 caliber machine guns in the nose, scavenging weapons from wrecked fighters because official channels couldn't provide them fast enough, test firing the installations, until he discovered that the muzzle blast from guns mounted behind the propeller arc would peel the skin off the fuselage, forcing him to extend the barrels with blast tubes that reached past the props, solving one problem only to discover that the concentrated firepower of 4 nose guns would crack. The aircraft structure, requiring reinforcement plates and shock-absorbing mounts, each solution creating new challenges that Gun attacked with the determination of a man who lost his family to Japanese imprisonment in the Philippines. By December 1942, Gun had moved on to the B-25 Mitchels, a bigger aircraft that could carry more guns and more ammunition. Working at the Townsville Modification Depot with mechanics from the 38th Bomb Group, cutting away the greenhouse nose designed for a bombardier, and installing a short and solid nose packed with 450 caliber machine guns, then adding the blister packages on the fuselage sides that would give the design its distinctive appearance. Each package containing 2 more 50 calibers with 400 rounds per gun. The ammunition boxes mounted inside the fuselage with blast shields to protect them from the muzzle flash, while test pilots reported that firing all 8 forward guns simultaneously felt like hitting a brick wall in midair, the recoil actually slowing the aircraft's forward speed. The first combat test had come in January 1943 when modified B-25S attacked a Japanese convoy attempting to reinforce LA, achieving hits, but not the decisive results Kenny wanted, leading to further refinements in tactics with pilots practicing skip bombing runs against the wreck of SS Proof, a freighter that had run aground on a reef near Port Moresby in 1924, learning through trial and error that the ideal approach was to come in at 200 Farads feet altitude and 300 meters per hour, dropping to mast height at 600 yards from the target, releasing a stick of 4 500-pound bombs with 5-second delay fuses at 300 yards. The bomb skipping across the water to strike at or below the waterline while the pilot pulled up and over the target, clearing the ship's superstructure by mere feet. The practice runs weren't without casualties, as one B-25 collided with the PRA's mast during a training run. Another was damaged by fragments from its own bombs, detonating too close, and several aircraft returned with pieces of the target vessel's structure embedded in their wings and fuselages. But by late February 1943, the 5th Air Force had dozens of modified B-25 strafers, with crews trained in skip bombing, coordinating with Australian bow fighters that would suppress anti-aircraft fire with their 420mm cannons and 6 machine guns, creating a deadly combination that was about to be unleashed on Admiral Kimura's convoy. Meanwhile, across the globe in the Atlantic, German U-boat commander Captain Lieutenant Werner Hanke, commanding U-515, had just received reports from Naval High Command about increasing Allied air patrols that were making their traditional surface operations increasingly dangerous, forcing submarines to remain submerged for longer periods, reducing their speed and effectiveness with new long-range aircraft like the B-24 Liberator, closing what had been the mid-Atlantic gap where U-boat could operate beyond the reach of land-based aircraft, while Admiral Karl Donitz at U-boat headquarters in France studied the loss reports showing that Allied aircraft were becoming devastatingly effective at catching U-boat on the surface, particularly the modified bombers equipped with powerful searchlights and depth charges. The German submarine force had entered 1,943 with confidence, having sunk over 6 million tons of Allied shipping in 1942. Their Wolfpack tactics coordinating multiple submarines to overwhelm convoy escorts. But the introduction of escort carriers, long-range aircraft, and improved radar was beginning to shift the balance, with U-boat losses climbing from 27 inches 1,940 to 87 inches 1,942. and the trend accelerating in early 1943 as Allied aircraft equipped with new centimetric radar that German detection equipment couldn't sense caught surface U-boat by surprise. While experiments with flak U-boats, submarines equipped with heavy anti-aircraft armament, designed to fight it out on the surface with attacking aircraft, were proving that staying surfaced against determined air attack was suicide. In the Mediterranean, Italian naval commanders at La Spezia and Taranto were still recovering from the psychological shock of watching their battle fleet decimated by British carrier aircraft at Taranto in November 1940, when swordfish biplanes, obsolete-looking fabric-covered relics from an earlier era, had delivered torpedo attacks that sank or crippled 3 battleships in harbor, demonstrating that the age of the battleship was ending, that air power could reach anywhere, strike anything, and that the Regia Marina's lack of aircraft carriers and effective radar would prove fatal in a war increasingly dominated by aircraft. A lesson reinforced every time Allied bombers appeared over Italian naval bases, forcing ships to scatter to avoid the fate of sitting ducks at anchor. Admiral Angelo Aiacino, commander of the Italian battle fleet, had written in his war diary about the frustration of trying to operate in the Mediterranean without air cover, describing how Allied aircraft would shadow Italian task forces for hours, radioing their position to submarines and surface units, making surprise impossible, turning every sortie into a potential ambush. While the few Italian aircraft available for naval cooperation lacked the range and equipment for effective reconnaissance, leaving Italian commanders blind while their enemies saw everything. A disparity that had resulted in disasters like Cape Mipan, where British carrier aircraft had crippled the battleship Vittorio Veneto and enabled the destruction of 3 heavy cruisers in a night action. Back in the Bismarck Sea, as the morning of March 3rd, 1943 progressed, Admiral Kimura received reports from his escorting Zero fighters that American B-7 flying fortresses were approaching at high altitude, the type of attack the Japanese had prepared for, with his destroyers taking evasive action while anti-aircraft guns elevated to maximum range. The convoy turning to present the smallest possible target as bombs began falling from 20 feet, most splashing harmlessly into the sea. As expected though, one transport took a direct hit that started fires below deck. Manageable damage that the ship's crew could control. Nothing that would stop the convoy from reaching LA the next morning. But at 000 hours, Kimura's lookouts reported something different. Aircraft approaching from the south at extreme low altitude. So low they were difficult to spot against the ocean surface, their engine noise masked by the convoy's own machinery until they were almost upon them. And as the first wave of B-25 strafers and Australian Beaufighters swept in, Kimura experienced a moment of incomprehension. These weren't behaving like any bombers in Japanese naval doctrine. They were coming straight at his ships at masthead height. And suddenly, the air was filled with streams of 50 caliber tracers as 8 forward-firing guns on each B-25 opened up simultaneously. The concentrated firepower sweeping across Shirayuki's deck like a scythe. The Japanese had never encountered anything like this concentrated strafing attack. As each B-25 strafer unleashed over 3,000 rounds per minute from its 8 forward guns. The armor-piercing and incendiary rounds punching through the destroyer's light anti-aircraft shields, through the deck plating, through anything in their path. While gun crews who moments before had been tracking high-altitude bombers were literally blown apart by the concentrated fire. Their 25mm anti-aircraft guns designed to engage aircraft at altitude, unable to depress low enough to target aircraft skimming the wave tops, leaving only small caliber machine guns to respond. Their fire ineffective against the B-25's armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks. Lieutenant Commander John Henter, leading the first wave of B-25s from the 90th Bombardment Squadron, later described the attack run. We went in so low that the prop wash was throwing up spray behind us. 8 ships ahead spread across the sea, and as we opened up with all guns, you could see our tracers walking across the water and up the side of the transport, across the deck, where men were running for cover that didn't exist, the incendiary rounds flashing as they hit. and at 300 yards. We pickled our bombs, pulled up hard to clear the masts, and looking back, saw the bomb skip once, twice, then slam into the hull right at the waterline. The skip bombing technique that Papy gun and the 5th Air Force had perfected turned every B-25 into a precision weapon. As pilots who had trained against the proof put their bombs exactly where they wanted them, the 500-pounders with their 5-second delay fuses punching through the thin hull plating of transports before detonating inside, the explosion contained by the ship's structure, magnifying the destructive effect, while near misses that detonated alongside created massive water hammers that crushed hull plates and sprung seams, flooding compartments faster than damage control could respond. Within the first 3 minutes of the attack, transport Kaakuzi Maru took 4 direct hits from skip bombs and began listing heavily to port, her captain ordering abandoned ship as ammunition in her forward holds began exploding, sending debris hundreds of feet into the air, while Teomaru, struck by incendiary rounds from strafing bow fighters that ignited fuel barrels lashed to her deck, became an inferno that spread faster than her crew could fight it. Men jumping overboard to escape the flames, only to be machine-gunned in the water by following aircraft, a tactic the Allies had adopted after Japanese fighters had strafed American aircrew in parachutes earlier in the war. Admiral Kimura on Shiryuki's bridge watched in horror as his carefully arranged defensive formation disintegrated. Destroyers that should have been providing anti-aircraft coverage were fighting for their own survival as B-25s assigned to each warship made repeated strafing runs, their 8 forward guns turning upper decks into Cheryl houses, while skip bombs aimed at the destroyer's engine rooms threatened to their ability to maneuver, and through the chaos, he could see more waves of aircraft approaching. B, 25 seconds at low level. B, 7S at medium altitude. Australian bow fighters sweeping in from different angles. A coordinated attack that gave his gunners no single threat to focus on the destroyer. Arashio took 3 direct hits from skip bombs that destroyed her engine room and started uncontrollable flooding, her captain attempting to beat her on a nearby reef before she sank. But another wave of B-25s caught her dead in the water, their strafing runs, killing most of the damage control parties trying to save the ship, while destroyer Tokitsaki's, hit by bombs that detonated in her forward magazine, simply disappeared in a massive explosion that threw debris onto ships 500 yards away, taking down the Army commander, General Adachi Hatazo, and his entire staff who had been aboard by 1 hour. Just 15 minutes after the first low-level attack began, 7 of 8 transports were sinking or sunk, the 8th mortally wounded and abandoned, while 4 of Kimura's 8 destroyers were either sunk, bunker sinking, the Admiral himself, wounded by machine gun fire that had raked Shiryuki's bridge, his flagship stern blown off by a bomb explosion that detonated her depth charges. And as he transferred his flag to destroyer Shikanami, Kimura could see hundreds of men in the water, some clinging to debris, others simply floating, face down. The sea around the shattered convoy turning red with blood as sharks attracted by the carnage began attacking survivors. The Japanese Navy's after-action report compiled from survivors' accounts described the attack as unlike anything they had encountered in the war. The combination of overwhelming firepower from the strafing runs that suppressed all defensive response, followed immediately by precision skip bombing that put bombs exactly where they would do the most damage. The whole attack coordinated so that ships trying to aid stricken vessels became targets themselves. Rescue operations impossible under the continuous air assault that lasted through the morning as Allied aircraft returned to Port Moresby, rearmed, refueled, and came back for additional attacks on any vessel still afloat. Captain Tamachihara, commanding destroyer Matsuki's in another convoy, would later write about the reports that reached the Japanese fleet after the Bismarck Sea disaster, describing the shock that ran through the Imperial Navy at the completeness of the destruction. The fact that not a single soldier of the 51st Infantry Division reached LA, that the vaunted destroyer escorts that had dominated the Solomon Islands night battles were helpless against this new form of air attack. And most disturbing, that the Americans had developed these tactics specifically to counter Japanese naval operations, turning their bombers into anti-shipping weapons that could strike anywhere within range of their airfields. At Rebel, the Japanese Southeast Area Fleet Headquarters Staff Officer Commander Masite Okumiya recorded the impact of the battle. Our losses for this single battle were fantastic. Not during the entire savage fighting at Guadalcanal did we suffer a single comparable blow. We knew we could no longer run cargo ships or even fast destroyer transports to any front on the north coast of New Guinea. East of WWII, the Americans had achieved complete air superiority, and their new tactics made surface vessels virtually defenseless. The myth of the destroyer's speed and maneuverability, protecting it from air attack, died in the Bismarck Sea. The battle's impact rippled far beyond the Southwest Pacific as Allied air forces in other theaters studied the success of the B-25 strafer modifications and skip bombing tactics. While General Kenny, promoted and decorated for the victory, pushed for more B-25 seconds to be modified to the strafer configuration, eventually seeing the factory-produced B-25J model incorporate 8 forward-firing 50 caliber guns as standard equipment, with some variants carrying up to 18 machine guns total, including top turret, waist, and tail positions, creating flying gunships that would devastate Japanese shipping throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. In Germany, Admiral Donitz received intelligence reports about the Bismarck Sea battle through Japanese naval attaches, noting with concern the effectiveness of concentrated aerial strafing against surface vessels, a tactic that could be equally devastating against you caught on the surface. And within weeks of the battle, new orders went out to boat commanders, emphasizing the need to crash dive at the first sign of aircraft, abandoning any attempt to fight it out on the surface. Resources were poured into developing snorkels that would allow submarines to run on diesel engines while submerged, reducing their vulnerability to air attack. The U-Boat Forces Black May was only 2 months away when the combination of long-range aircraft escort carriers and improved Allied tactics would result in the loss of 41 U-Boat in a single month, forcing Donitz to withdraw his submarines from the North Atlantic convoy routes, admitting in his war diary that the Battle of the Atlantic was lost. That aircraft equipped with radar and depth charges had made the traditional U-Boat warfare of surface attacks and wolfpack tactics obsolete, just as the B-25 strafers had made traditional surface convoy operations obsolete in the Pacific. Italian naval commanders studying both the Bismarck Sea battle and the increasing effectiveness of Allied air attacks in the Mediterranean recognized that without aircraft carriers and modern radar, the Regia Marina was effectively neutralized, confined to port, or restricted to operations under the cover of land-based aircraft that were themselves being steadily destroyed by Allied bombing, while convoy operations to North Africa became increasingly costly, as modified bombers using similar low-level tactics devastated Italian merchant shipping, forcing the use of submarines and small, fast vessels for supply runs inadequate to sustain the Africa Corps operations. The technological revolution that Papy gun had initiated in the modification shops of Townsville, taking a standard medium bomber and transforming it into a strafer gunship, represented a fundamental shift in naval warfare, demonstrating that aircraft properly equipped and employed could dominate surface vessels, regardless of their speed, armor, or defensive armament. A lesson written in blood across the waters of the Bismarck Sea, where the oil slicks and debris fields marked the grave of an entire Japanese convoy, destroyed in 15 minutes by modified bombers that had cost a fraction of what a single destroyer represented in resources and manpower. General Douglas MacArthur, commander of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific, called the Battle of the Bismarck Sea the decisive aerial engagement of the war in the Southwest Pacific, noting that it had secured the northeastern coast of New Guinea from Japanese reinforcement, making possible the Allied advance that would eventually lead to the Philippines. While the psychological impact on Japanese forces was even greater than the material losses, knowing that any movement by sea within range of Allied airfields meant almost certain destruction, forcing them to rely on submarines and barges moving at night, insufficient to maintain their scattered garrisons. The B-25 strafer design continued to evolve through 1943 and 1944, with later models incorporating a 75mm cannon in addition to machine guns, though many pilots preferred the pure gunship configuration, finding that the concentrated firepower of multiple 50 calibers was more effective than a single large caliber weapon, while tactics refined from the Bismarck Sea experience saw B-25 seconds operating in coordinated strikes with fighters suppressing air opposition, strafers eliminating anti-aircraft defenses, and skip bombers delivering the killing blows. A combined arms approach that would devastate Japanese shipping throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Gunn, promoted and decorated for his innovations, continued developing new modifications and tactics until his death in a plane crash in October 1957. But his legacy lived on in the thousands of Japanese vessels sunk by strafer gunships, in the doctrine of low-level anti-shipping attacks that became standard in air forces worldwide, and in the fundamental principle. He had proven that with enough forward firepower, a bomber could become a ship killer, overwhelming any defense through sheer weight of fire. A principle demonstrated with devastating clarity in those 15 minutes over the Bismarck Sea. The Japanese Navy's official history, compiled after the war, identified the Battle of the Bismarck Sea as the point where Japan lost effective use of the sea lanes to New Guinea, forcing them onto the strategic defensive for the remainder of the war. While individual ship captains and convoy commanders had nightmares about low-flying B-25s appearing out of nowhere, 8 guns blazing, knowing that their anti-aircraft weapons designed for high-altitude bombers were useless against aircraft attacking at mass height, that their speed and maneuverability meant nothing when the enemy could put a wall of lead across their path. In the broader context of World War II, the B-25 strafers demonstrated that innovation and adaptation could overcome numerical and material disadvantages, that a 52-year-old former enlisted man working with scavenged parts in a modification depot could develop tactics and technologies that would change the course of the war, that the marriage of skip bombing and concentrated forward firepower could turn a medium bomber designed for level bombing from altitude into one of the most effective anti-shipping weapons of the war, a transformation that caught the Axis powers completely unprepared. The last survivor of Admiral Kimura's staff, who had been rescued by destroyer Shikanami after Shirayuki sank, would later testify at war crimes trials about the attack, describing how the American bombers had seemed to come from nowhere, flying so low that they appeared to rise out of the sea itself, their nose guns lighting up like welding torches as they bore in, the sound of their engines drowned out by the hammering of 50 caliber rounds tearing into steel, and then the bombs skipping across the water with almost playful bounces before slamming, coming into holes with devastating effect. The entire attack so fast, so coordinated, so overwhelming that defense was impossible. The effectiveness of the B-25 strafers would be proven again and again throughout 1943 and 1944 at WWII, where they destroyed 60 aircraft on the ground and sank numerous vessels in harbor in the Philippines, where they devastated Japanese attempts to reinforce Leh in the Netherlands, East Indies, where they made Japanese coastal shipping impossible. Each success building on the lessons learned at the Bismarck Sea, refining the tactics, improving the modifications until by war's end, the sight of B-25 seconds approaching at low level was enough to make Japanese crews abandon ship rather than face the inevitable destruction. German naval attaches in Tokyo, reporting on the Bismarck Sea battle and its aftermath, warned that similar tactics could be devastating if employed in the Atlantic or Mediterranean. That the concentration of forward firepower demonstrated by the B-25 strafers exceeded anything mounted on existing naval vessels for anti-aircraft defense. That the combination of strafing to suppress defenses, followed by skip bombing to deliver killing blows, represented a tactical innovation that made surface vessels obsolete in areas within range of enemy air power. Warnings that would prove prophetic as Allied air forces adopted similar tactics worldwide. The Italian Navy's experience in the Mediterranean paralleled that of the Japanese in the Pacific, as Allied aircraft equipped with forward-firing cannon and rockets devastated convoy operations to North Africa, forcing the Italians to attempt supply runs with submarines and small, fast craft inadequate to sustain military operations, while the few remaining major surface units huddled in port under whatever air cover could be provided, knowing that venturing out meant facing the same fate as Kimura's convoy: destruction from the air, against which there was no effective defense. As 1943 progressed and news of the Bismarck Sea filtered through military channels worldwide, naval planners began reassessing fundamental assumptions about surface warfare, recognizing that the era of the battleship and even the destroyer as masters of the sea was ending, that aircraft properly equipped could dominate any surface vessel, that the B-25 strafers had proven air power could not only sink ships, but could do so with an efficiency and economy that made traditional naval operations unsustainable, a lesson that would shape naval development for decades to come. The pilots who flew the B-25 strafers at the Bismarck Sea would go on to become some of the most decorated aviators of the war, their success spawning an entire generation of low-level attack specialists who would perfect the art of ship killing from the air, while maintenance crews who had worked with Papy gun to install the gun packages and reinforcements became experts in field modifications, adapting aircraft to specific mission requirements, a flexibility that gave Allied air forces a decisive advantage over their more rigid opponents. In the final analysis, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea represented more than just the destruction of a Japanese convoy. It marked a fundamental shift in the balance of power in the Pacific, demonstrating that air power properly applied could control sea lanes more effectively than surface fleets, that innovation and adaptation could overcome traditional military advantages, and that a handful of modified bombers flown by determined crews could achieve what entire naval task forces could not: the complete annihilation of enemy shipping in minutes rather than hours or days. The legacy of the B-25 strafers extended far beyond World War II, influencing the development of dedicated ground attack aircraft like the A-10 Thunderbolt II with its massive forward-firing cannon, establishing the principle that concentrated forward firepower could overwhelm any point defense, a principle proven in those 15 devastating minutes over the Bismarck Sea when Admiral Kimura watched his entire convoy disappear beneath the waves, victims of an innovation that had transformed medium bombers into the deadliest ship killers of the Pacific War. For the Japanese Navy, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea became a turning point from which there was no recovery, forcing them to abandon any hope of maintaining their New Guinea garrisons by surface convoy, condemning those forces to slow starvation and eventual defeat. While the psychological impact of the complete destruction of an entire convoy protected by 8 destroyers sent shockwaves through the Imperial Navy, shattering the confidence that had carried them through the early war victories, replacing it with the knowledge that American innovation and industrial might would inevitably overwhelm them. The Germans learned from the Japanese experience, but too late to prevent their own disasters, as the U-boat forces attempt to fight it out on the surface with aircraft in 1943 resulted in catastrophic losses that broke the back of the submarine campaign, forcing them underwater where they were slow and increasingly vulnerable to detection. While in the Mediterranean, Italian naval forces could only watch helplessly as Allied aircraft systematically destroyed their ability to operate, reducing the once proud Regia Marina to a coastal defense force, unable to project power beyond the range of land-based fighter cover. Admiral Kimura, who survived the battle despite being wounded, would spend the rest of the war in increasingly desperate operations, but never forgot those 15 minutes over the Bismarck Sea when he learned that everything the Imperial Navy had taught about naval warfare was obsolete. That 8 forward-firing machine guns on a modified bomber could do what entire squadrons of torpedo planes might fail to achieve, and that the Americans had found in Paul Papy gun and General George Kenny the perfect combination of innovation and determination to revolutionize aerial warfare against shipping. The statistics from the Battle of the Bismarck Sea tell only part of the story. 8 transports sunk, 4 destroyers sunk, approximately 3,000. Japanese soldiers and sailors killed against Allied losses of 4 aircraft and 13 aircrew. But those numbers don't capture the revolution in military thinking that the battle represented, the proof that air power had superseded sea power, that a bomber modified in a field depot could be more effective than a destroyer built in a major shipyard. That innovation and adaptation could overcome tradition and doctrine. In the broader context of World War II, the B-25 strafers represented American ingenuity at its finest, taking an existing aircraft and transforming it into something its designers never envisioned, solving each technical challenge through practical experimentation rather than lengthy development programs, getting results in the field that would have taken years to achieve through normal channels, a flexibility and adaptiveness that would prove decisive in winning the war. Turning the tide in the Pacific through innovations like skip bombing and concentrated forward firepower. The last Japanese transport to sink in the Bismarck Sea, Umaru, went down in the evening of March 3rd. Itenjobai Sujisan, torpedoed by American PT boats that found her drifting and abandoned, her crew having been taken off by destroyers that themselves were fighting for survival.